I think by now we've seen all kinds of different versions of this depressing chart, total U.S. debt. Back in 1998, we'll be talking about that year when Bill Clinton was president and we had our first budget surplus since 1969. The debt level was about $5.5 trillion. When I arrived here my first year in the Senate in 2011, that was about $14 trillion. I ran, quite honestly, because we were mortgaging our children's future. We'll talk a little bit about 2014 when President Obama had a certain spending level. That was up to $17.5 trillion. As recent as 2019, before the pandemic, our debt was somewhere around $22.5 trillion. Today, our debt exceeds $36 trillion on a path toward much higher heights. If you look at President Biden's final budget here, he's predicting our total debt will be $52 trillion at the end of 10 years. This is clearly unsustainable. As I said, it's a depressing reality. The result of all that debt, one of the many results, was the devaluation of the dollar. A dollar you held in 1998 is only worth 51 cents today. We basically cut the value of a dollar in half since 1998. 2014, when President Obama was president, now the value of that dollar is only worth 74 cents. The value of a dollar prior to the pandemic, 2019, is now only worth 80 cents. That's why people can't afford things. This inflation caused by massive deficit spending, this is the stealth tax on every American. It's a very regressive tax. It primarily hurts people at the bottom part of the income spectrum. You know, wealthy individuals have stocks, they have other assets that inflate as the dollar devalues. So again, this harm primarily affects lower incomes Americans. The people, the men and women who work are harmed by this. This can't go on. This is an outrage. This is a tragedy. Mr. President, I just want to ask a little bit of a hypothetical here before we talk about this chart. Let's say you're an American family of four, and you're doing pretty good. You make and you spend about $100,000 a year. Let's say the next year you have a serious illness in your family, and all of a sudden you have major medical bills totaling $50,000. So the next year you spend $150,000. Let's say you get some good news. That medical condition is now solved, your family member is healed. What would most American families do? If their income level stayed the same, around $100,000, I don't think they'd keep spending at a $150,000 level. They certainly wouldn't borrow $50,000 to maintain that spending level. They would reduce their spending level back to what it was before the illness, right? They go back somewhere around $100,000, maybe a little bit more based on inflation. That's not what the federal government did. This, I know, is shocking most Americans as I'm laying out the reality of the situation. In 2019, prior to the pandemic, total federal government spending was $4.4 trillion. Then we had COVID, and I think we very unwisely shut down a lot of our economy. It destroyed people's businesses. It destroyed people's lives, our miserable, failed response to COVID. It cost a lot of money. So Washington went on a massive spending spree. In the year of the pandemic, we spent actually closer to $6.6 trillion. Now again, if it would have been like a normal family, once the pandemic passed, we would have returned to some reasonable spending level, but we didn't do that. The last 5 years now, we've spent, on average, $6.5 trillion. That's $2.1 trillion more than we spent in 2019. There's no justification for that. This last year, we spent a total of $6.9 trillion, $2.6 trillion, $2.5 trillion higher than the $4.4 trillion. Again, there's no justification for that. So the question I've been asking is how do we return to a reasonable pre-pandemic spending level. I will guarantee you that the people that voted for President Trump do not expect the federal government's going to continue spending at President Biden and the Democrats who've been in charge at their spending levels. This is unacceptable. It's unsustainable. So what I've done is I've laid out a couple of different options here. Again, I'll use another analogy. Let's say that same family of four I was talking about that had an income of about $100,000. Let's say they have a baby. So now their population, their family size has increased 25%. I think most people would recognize that if that family of four could increase their income 25% from $100,000 to $125,000 and then tack on an amount for inflation. Let's say it's 3% inflation up to $128,750. I think most people would recognize, well, now that family's kept whole. They've been made whole. They've been able to maintain their standard of living. Well, I think the same thing would be true for the federal government. For Americans living within America, looking at different benefits that the federal government bestows on Americans as it extracts our hard-earned tax dollars. So I went back to a number of different years prior to the pandemic. I went back to 1998. Again, that was the first year we actually had a budget surplus since 1969. That's how irresponsible the government's always been. But back in 1998, what a magic moment. We actually had a budget surplus. That was under Bill Clinton. We spent $1.7 trillion. So, that's obviously too low because we've had inflation, we've had population growth. So what I've done in each one of these scenarios here is I've taken the basic spending levels, I've increased them based on population growth and inflation, plus I exempt Social Security, Medicare, and interest. And I've plugged in President Biden's 2025 budget amounts for Social Security, Medicare, and interest. So the result of that analysis for 1998, for Bill Clinton's spending level, I don't think anybody would really argue that Bill Clinton spent too little in 1998. If you did that, inflate it, increase it based on population and inflation, plus you use today's 2025 Social Security, Medicare, and interest expense, you'd end up at $5.5 trillion. It's not a secret. The reason I chose 1998, I looked at all these years, doing that with 1998 spending levels, if you compare that to President Biden's budgeted revenue for this year, which has not decreased because of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, revenue has consistently increased to $5.5 trillion, we would have a balanced budget. What everybody says is impossible to achieve, going back to Bill Clinton's spending levels, increasing them by population and inflation, and using today's Social Security, Medicare, and interest expense, would balance the budget. We wouldn't have to increase the debt ceiling. We wouldn't be experiencing or threatened by more inflation. Okay, if that's too reasonable for Washington, D.C., let's look at another scenario. Let's take a look at at President Obama's spending levels in 2014. Again, I don't think President Obama was spending too little in 2014. I was here. He was spending too much. But if you take his 2014 levels, inflate them by population growth since then and inflation, using today's Social Security, Medicare, and interest, we'd be spending $6.2 trillion this year. Pretty reasonable. Not a balanced budget, but a whole lot better than the $6.9 or the $7.3 trillion that President Biden budgeted for this year. A far more reasonable spending level. But if you don't like that, if that's just too reasonable, too aggressive for you, just go back to 2019 when we spent $4.4 trillion. Increase it by population growth, inflation, using President Biden's Social Security, Medicare, and interest, it'd be 6.5. I think that's completely unacceptable. That's been the average. We increase that, $2.1 trillion above the $4.4 trillion, it'd still be a whole lot better than President Biden's $7.3 trillion or last year's spending of $6.9 trillion. How can anybody justify spending at this level when we were only spending $4.4 trillion 5 years ago? Here's what I'm suggesting. Set those other scenarios aside. President Trump was just elected. Again, I don't think anybody, certainly not me, I voted for President Trump. I was not expecting President Trump, and I do not expect him to come into office and accept and spend at President Biden's levels. So I would encourage President Trump to go back and take a look at the final budget he proposed back in fiscal year 2021 and look at his estimate for spending in 2025. So I've done the exact same thing. I'm using the fiscal year 2025 estimates from his last budget, but I'm using this year's Social Security, Medicare, and interest expense. If we do that, we're looking at a spending level of about $6 trillion. So again, we can look at individual expense items. You can take a look at defense if you don't think we're spending enough on that, if it's too risky a world. I mean, somewhere within the range of 5.5, which would literally balance our budget up to $6.2 trillion. That's a reasonable base that we ought to include in a budget we'll be passing this year that should drive future spending. That would reset spending levels to a far more reasonable level. And again, let me just reemphasize. Whether we use Bill Clinton's 1998 spending level, which would result in a $5.5 trillion baseline, Barack Obama's 2014 spending levels, which would result in a baseline budget of $6.2 trillion, or President Trump's final budget, which would result in a $6 trillion spending level. That's a reasonable approach. That's what families do. That's what businesses in America are forced to do. They don't just say, spend whatever you want. Put 70% of our spending budget on automatic pilot. We'll never look at it. We just spend whatever we want. That's how you bankrupt a family. That's how you bankrupt a business. That's how we're mortgaging our children's future. It has to stop. So I'm putting everybody on notice. I'm on the Budget Committee. I'm on the Finance Committee. I'm going to insist that the budget we pass, now that Republicans are in control in the Senate, returns to some reasonable baseline. Listen, I'm reasonable. I'll negotiate. I'm not saying this is gospel. This isn't etched in stone. But President Trump, our majority leader, our majority leadership, House leadership, they're going to have to justify to me how you would justify spending more than these reasonable baselines. I ran in 2010 because we were mortgaging our children's future. I remember doing parades, shouting that. We're mortgaging our children's future. It's immoral. It has to stop. We're spending 25% of GDP at the federal government level. That's not the vision of our founding fathers. Of sovereign states, where government is primarily at the state level, at the local level, where it's close to the people, where it's more efficient, it's more effective, it's more accountable. Now Washington is gobbling up all of our resources, borrowing these vast amounts of money, devaluing our currency. They're not solving problems. They're not reducing poverty. They're not making lives better. They're putting American lives at risk. And as government grows, our freedoms recede. And Americans have to understand of all the things that have made this country great, the men and women who have worked and built this marvel of a nation, the one essential ingredient they've always used is just that freedom. It's freedom that allowed them to dream and aspire and build and create this marvel of a country. It's freedom that allow these young people sitting in front of me here to do the same thing. But as long as government continues to grow, those freedoms will necessarily recede. It's a direct relationship. So we allow government to grow way too large. It influences too much of our lives, negatively influences it. We need to jealously guard our freedom. We need to jealously reclaim our freedom. And the best way to do that is to shrink the size, scope, and cost of government and its influence over our lives. And the only way to do that is you have to reduce total spending by the federal government. This is the metric. We talk about all kinds of things. That's the metric. And one final point. We're not going to be able to tax our way out of this. We don't have a taxation problem, we have a spending problem. And I just want to make my final comment. The refuting of the false narrative that we hear ad nauseum from the other side. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act did not cause our deficits. When CBO scored that, the score at the time of passage was that it was going to reduce revenue and increase our deficits by $1.5 trillion. When CBO then, after passage, I think it was April 2018, projected out revenue for 10 years, if you take a look at that revenue, from 2018 through 2024, we actually have the actual results. They projected about $27 trillion worth of revenue over that 7-year period. The actual amount of revenue we raised from 2018 through 2024 was $28.7 trillion. We beat CBO's estimate by $1.7 trillion. So if the original score was $1.5 trillion, it was. In 7 years, we actually beat their estimate by $1.7. We paid for that tax cut in 7 years, plus $200 billion. And we had the severe COVID recession in the middle of that. So don't believe anybody that tells you the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act caused our deficits. They didn't. They paid for themselves in less than 7 years and then some. We have a spending problem in this country. There's no justification for going from $4.4 trillion to $6.5 trillion. And now we're at 6.9 with no end in sight. This is immoral what we're doing to our children. We've got to get this under control. And this is about as good a rationale, as good a justification for setting some dollar limit and using the budget process unlike we've ever used it before. Not just for being able to pass some kind of reconciliation package with a mere majority vote, but actually use the budget the way American families and American businesses do to set the spending limits. And then ask our committees and the chair of our committees to take those budget caps seriously and figure out how they can structure spending, how they can structure these programs to actually live within those budget caps. And again, if they actually used Bill Clinton's 1998 spending level and inflated the way I've done here, actually balance the budget. That's what the people who came out in November voting for President Trump, that's their goal. That's their expectation. I suggest we live up to their expectations. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.